The caravel Sangre del Mar carved through Caribbean waters like a blade through silk, her crimson sails visible from leagues away, a warning that needed no flag. Captain Rodrigo Velasco, whom men called the Red Captain for reasons both evident and whispered, stood at the helm with hands stained darker than the oak wood beneath his palms. 23 engagements he had survived. 23 ships he had taken or sent to the depths, Spanish galleons, English merchantmen, Dutch traders, all had learned to fear those red sails, and none who raised arms against him had lived to carry the tale home. But the wind that September morning in 1718 carried something fouler than salt and gunpowder. It carried suspicion. If you're captivated by tales of treachery on the high seas, subscribe now and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The trouble had begun 3 weeks prior, when they'd intercepted a Portuguese slave ship off the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola. The São Miguel had carried no silver, no spices, no European manufactured goods, only human cargo chained in the suffocating darkness below deck and a locked chest in the captain's cabin. That chest had contained something that made even Velasco's weathered face go pale. A map marked with coordinates and a manifest listing a cargo that the Portuguese crown had been transporting in absolute secrecy. Not gold, not jewels, something the manifest called only El Regalo del Rey, the king's gift. Whatever it was, the Portuguese captain had chosen death over revelation, putting a flintlock pistol to his own temple the moment Velasco's boarding party breached his cabin. The explosion had splattered the map with blood and brain matter, but the parchment remained legible. The Red Captain had taken it, folded it carefully, and locked it in his own sea chest without explanation. He'd ordered the São Miguel scuttled, her surviving crew given a single longboat and a barrel of water, more mercy than most pirates would have shown. But Velasco had always maintained that needless cruelty marked a captain who feared his own weakness. The crew had seen the map, though. Word spread through the Sangre del Mar like yellow fever through a port town. Whispers in the hold during night watches. Murmurs in the galley over hardtack and salted pork. The first mate, a scarred Welshman named Gareth Pugh, who'd sailed with Velasco since they'd both served as privateers during Queen Anne's War, noticed the change first. Men who'd fought shoulder to shoulder for years now watched each other with narrowed eyes. The quartermaster, a freed African named Zachariah, who kept the crew's accounts and distributed shares with mathematical precision, reported that private conversations ceased whenever he approached. Even young Thomas Marsh, the ship's navigator who'd learned his charts under Velasco's own tutelage, had grown evasive, his eyes darting away when the captain addressed him directly. They'd made port at Nassau 3 days ago, that lawless sanctuary in the Bahamas, where Governor Woodes Rogers's authority barely extended beyond the harbour batteries, where rum flowed cheaper than fresh water and loose tongues were currency. Velasco had forbidden his crew from speaking about the map, but he knew the futility of such orders once sailors reached land and alcohol. He'd watched from the shadowed doorway of a dockside tavern as his men gathered in tight knots, speaking low, their faces illuminated by tallow candles, and their words swallowed by the raucous singing of drunken buccaneers celebrating some recent plunder. One man stood apart from the clusters, moving between groups like a spider tending its web. The ship's boatswain, a Portuguese-born sailor named Vicente Cabral. Velasco had taken him on 6 months ago in Port Royal, after his previous boatswain had died of fever, a routine addition to the crew that had seemed unremarkable at the time. Cabral was competent with rope and sail, kept good discipline among the working parties, and asked for nothing beyond his fair share of plunder. Yet watching him that night in Nassau, seeing how men leaned close when he spoke, how they nodded and dispersed with new purpose in their movements, Velasco felt cold certainty settle in his chest, like anchor chain. This was the viper he'd welcomed aboard. The Red Captain had killed his first man at 14. a Spanish soldier who'd tried to conscript him into the garrison at Havana, where Velasco had been born, to a mestiza mother and a father whose name he'd never known. He'd killed his 50th man before he turned 25. Somewhere after that, he'd stopped counting. Violence had been his trade, his survival, his pathway from the gutters of colonial ports to command of his own vessel. He understood battle, the geometry of cannon fire, the timing of boarding actions, the psychology of surrender. What he did not understand, had never needed to understand, was the slow poison of conspiracy, the erosion of loyalty when men convinced themselves that their captain stood between them and unimaginable wealth. They sailed from Nassau with a full hold of supplies and a crew that had grown quiet in ways that made the silence more oppressive than any storm. The wind drove them south-southwest toward the coast of Hispaniola, where French and Spanish settlements competed for dominance of that vast island's interior, and pirates moved freely between both territories, depending on which colonial power currently paid better for stolen goods or offered sanctuary from their rivals. Velasco had contacts in Petit Goave, the French stronghold on Hispaniola's western coast, men who could translate the Portuguese map and perhaps explain what El Regalo del Rey might mean. But he would never reach Petit Goave. The mutiny came on the third night out from Nassau, during the midnight watch, when half the crew slept below and only a skeleton crew managed the sails under a moonless sky. Velasco stood at the stern rail, smoking a pipe of Virginia tobacco and watching the wake trail phosphorescent behind them, when he heard the footsteps. Too many footsteps, approaching with coordinated purpose, rather than the random movement of men about their duties. He turned to see 12 men spreading across the deck, cutlasses drawn, pistols primed. Vicente Cabral stood at their center, a boarding axe in his hands and something like regret in his eyes, but not enough regret to stop him from raising that axe and speaking words that Velasco had known would come eventually, though perhaps not this soon, not from this crew he'd thought bound by shared danger and shared profit. "The map, Captain. Give us the map and we'll put you ashore with provisions. Resist, and you'll feed the sharks before dawn." Velasco's hand moved to the pistol at his belt, then stopped. His weapons master, Eduardo, stood among the mutineers, as did the sailmaker and 3 of his most experienced gunners. Gareth Pugh was nowhere visible, either dead already or confined below deck. The odds were impossible. He'd survived 23 battles by understanding when to fight and when to recognize that certain fights could not be won. "You're a fool, Cabral," Velasco said quietly, and his voice carried across the deck despite its softness, commanding attention even now. "That map leads to nothing but death. The Portuguese captain killed himself to protect whatever secret it holds. Do you imagine the Portuguese crown will let pirates simply claim their gift without consequence?" "Rich men's concerns," Cabral replied. "The Portuguese captain was a coward who feared his masters more than death. We fear neither." He gestured with the axe. "The map, now." Velasco could have refused, could have drawn his pistol and killed at least one of them before they cut him down. But as he looked at the faces surrounding him, men he'd commanded, men who'd trusted him to lead them to profit and keep them alive, he saw not courage in their mutiny, but desperation. These were not devils. They were simply men who'd spent their lives in poverty, who'd turned to piracy because honest service meant starvation wages and brutal officers, who'd convinced themselves that somewhere beyond the horizon lay the fortune that would let them retire from this savage business and live as the wealthy lived in European capitals they'd never seen. He could not hate them for wanting that. He could only pity them for believing it existed. "My cabin," he said. "The map is locked in my sea chest." They bound his hands. Rope burns would join the countless scars already marking his wrists, and marched him below deck, with 4 men keeping weapons trained on his back. His cabin, which had been his sanctuary for 6 years, looked strange to him now, as if he were seeing it through a dead man's eyes, the Spanish charts on the walls marking safe harbors and shipping lanes. The astrolabe on his desk, a gift from a Portuguese merchant he'd spared in exchange for navigation tools. The small carved figure of La Virgen de la Caridad del Cobre that his mother had given him before the garrison soldier and the knife and the flight into piracy. He'd never believed, but he'd kept it anyway, some superstitious anchor to a childhood before blood and salt water. The sea chest sat beneath his bunk, iron-bound oak that had survived everything the Caribbean could throw at it. Velasco knelt, his bound hands awkward with the key they'd let him keep. Where else could he run? On a ship in open ocean, and opened the lock. Inside lay his personal effects, letters from informants in various ports, account books recording years of plunder and expenditure, a locket containing a miniature portrait of a woman whose name he'd once known, but could no longer recall. And beneath those, wrapped in oilcloth, the blood-stained map. He withdrew it slowly, stood, turned to face Cabral. "This is what you're killing me for," he said, offering the oilcloth bundle. "I hope it's worth your souls." Cabral took it, unwrapped it, studied the map by lamplight. His expression shifted from triumph to confusion. These coordinates. This is southwest of Trinidad. There's nothing there but open ocean and a few godforsaken rocks barely large enough to beach a longboat. "Perhaps that's where the treasure is buried," suggested Eduardo, crowding close to look. "Remote islands make ideal hiding places." "Or perhaps," Velasco said quietly, "the Portuguese captain killed himself because the map leads to something that should remain hidden. Did none of you wonder why the Crown would transport such a prize on a slave ship rather than a properly armed galleon? Did it not occur to you that they were hiding it from their own people as much as from pirates?" "More riddle," Cabral said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. He looked at the other mutineers, seeing his own doubt reflected there. The moment stretched, and Velasco recognized it. The instant when conspiracy faces consequence, when the bold plot becomes real action with real victims, when men must either commit fully to their chosen course or falter. Cabral did not falter. "Lock him in the hold," he ordered. "We sail for these coordinates. When we find what the map promises, we'll decide the captain's fate. If it's a treasure, we'll give him his share and let him go. If it's a trap—" He didn't finish, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. They dragged Velasco down through the orlop deck to the lowest part of the ship, where ballast stones and spare timber and the spare canvas lay in damp darkness. They chained him to a support beam, took his weapons, and even his pipe and tobacco, small cruelties that marked him as no longer captain, but prisoner, and left him with a single lantern whose oil would last perhaps 6 hours. In that darkness, Rodrigo Velasco faced what all men must face eventually, the end of power, the collapse of the myth of invincibility that surrounds those who command through force. He'd survived Spanish colonial authorities, English naval patrols, French privateers, Dutch merchant guards, storms that sent ships to the bottom, and fevers that killed more sailors than combat ever did. He'd survived everything the sea and the age of piracy could conjure, everything except the most common death of all for pirate captains, betrayal by their own crew. Above him, he heard the mutineers arguing about their course, heard Cabral shouting orders in broken English and Portuguese, heard the creaking of timbers as the Sangre del Mar came about and set a new heading, southwest of Trinidad, toward whatever waited at those blood-marked coordinates. The lantern oil burned lower, darkness gathered at the edges of its fading light. And in that darkness, the red captain who had survived every battle waited for the one enemy he could not defeat. Time, and the choices of desperate men. The next 2 days passed in a fever dream of partial sensations. They brought him food once, stale bread and water already going brackish in the cask, and emptied his waste bucket with expressions of disgust and discomfort, as if his reduction from captain to prisoner embarrassed them. He heard fragments of conversation from the deck above, arguments about navigation, speculation about the treasure, and once, a brief scuffle that ended with a scream and a splash that suggested someone had questioned Cabral's new authority and paid the ultimate price. The mutiny was devouring its own now, as mutinies always did. Whoever had gone overboard had been the first to die, but would not be the last. On the third day, the ship's motion changed. The regular rhythm of open ocean swells gave way to choppier water, the Sangre del Mar rising and falling in shorter intervals that suggested shallower depths and complex currents. They'd reached the coordinates or somewhere close to them. Velasco heard anchor chain rattling through the hawse hole, felt the ship swing and settle as it came to rest. Then footsteps on the ladder, multiple men descending, and the hold flooded with light from the opened hatch. Cabral stood before him, and the boatswain's face had changed. The confidence of 3 days ago had evaporated, replaced by something Velasco recognized instantly: fear. Not the healthy fear of battle or storm, but the deeper terror of men who sense they've made a fatal error and can no longer turn back. "What did you find?" Velasco asked. "Nothing," Cabral said, and his voice cracked on the word. "A rock, a barren spit of stone barely 300 yards across, not even large enough to merit a name on any chart. We rowed around the entire circumference. There's no beach, no cave, no place to bury anything larger than a single coin, just birds and their shit and stone." He grabbed Velasco by the shirt, pulled him forward until the chains went taut. "What game are you playing? Did you plant a false map to trap us? Was this revenge for some slight I don't even know I gave?" Velasco almost laughed, but the sound died in his throat. "I told you the map was cursed. I told you the Portuguese captain killed himself for a reason, but you wouldn't listen. Then what?" Cabral stopped, his eyes widening as understanding flickered there. "The map itself. It's not a treasure map. It's something else." "A marker," Velasco said quietly. "A warning, perhaps, or a record of something that was hidden there and then removed. Or—" And here the cold certainty that had been building in his mind for 3 days crystallized into terrible clarity. A deliberate lie, meant to send anyone who stole it to a specific location where something waits for them. As if in response to his words, a sound rolled across the water from the direction of the open ocean, the boom of signal cannon. Not the broadside roar of battle, but the precise, spaced reports of a ship announcing its presence and intentions. Velasco knew that pattern. Every sailor who'd operated in these waters knew it. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, pause, 1 shot. The signature of the Portuguese Guarda-Costa, the Coast Guard units that Spain and Portugal had deployed to hunt pirates with increasing effectiveness in recent years. Cabral's face went white. "How?" "The map," Velasco said. "The coordinates. They marked the rendezvous point, where Portuguese warships were to meet and coordinate their hunt for pirates operating south of Trinidad. You've just sailed us directly into their net. The São Miguel wasn't transporting treasure, it was carrying intelligence for an anti-piracy operation. The captain killed himself to prevent you from learning that, but you took the map anyway and assumed it meant wealth rather than death." The sound of cannon came again, closer now. Then another set of reports from a different direction, and another and another. 4 ships at least, possibly more, converging on the rock that the map had marked. They'd been waiting, hoping that whoever had killed the São Miguel would be stupid enough or greedy enough to follow the map to its conclusion. The Portuguese crown had set a trap and baited it with the promise of treasure, and Vicente Cabral had led them all straight into it. "Get us out of here!" Eduardo shouted from the deck, his voice carrying down through the hatch. "Full sail! We can outrun them if—" The explosion cut him off. Even in the hold, Velasco felt the impact as a cannonball struck the Sangre del Mar's hull, heard the terrible sound of oak splintering, felt the ship shudder like a wounded animal. A Portuguese ship had come around the rock's far side, perfectly positioned, its gunners already trained on their target. Another explosion, another impact, and now Velasco heard screaming from above. The chaos of men dying and a ship being systematically destroyed by an enemy that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The mutineers in the hold scattered, abandoning Velasco to rush topside and join whatever desperate defense Cabral was attempting to mount. But Velasco knew there would be no defense. The Portuguese had multiple ships, the advantage of preparation, and the righteous fury of a crown that had just lost a valuable vessel to pirates. They would show no mercy, offer no quarter. Every man aboard the Sangre del Mar would hang from Nassau's gallows if they were lucky, or be drawn and quartered in the plaza of some colonial capital if they were not. The third explosion breached the hull somewhere near where Velasco sat chained. Seawater began pouring through the gap, cold and violent, already ankle-deep and rising fast. The ship was settling, going down, and he would die here in the darkness, drowned like a rat in a trap, while above him men died by cannon and shot. He pulled at the chains, but they held fast. He'd installed them himself years ago, meant to secure prisoners taken for ransom. The irony was not lost on him. The water reached his knees, then his waist, shockingly cold, despite the Caribbean warmth. The lantern guttered and died, plunging the hold into absolute darkness. He could hear nothing now except the roar of incoming water and the distant muffled thunder of the Portuguese cannon systematically destroying everything he'd built over 2 decades of blood and plunder. Then, light, a sudden glow from the ladder, and a figure descending rapidly, splashing through the rising water. Gareth Pugh, the Welsh first mate, blood streaming from a gash across his forehead, a boarding axe in his hands. He reached Velasco and began chopping at the chains, not at the links, those were too strong, but at the beam itself, hacking through wood that 6 years of seawater had left partially rotten. "Cabral?" Velasco asked. "Dead. Took a cannonball to the chest. Half the crew's dead. The rest will be soon." The beam cracked. Pugh kicked it and the chains came free. "We've got one chance. They've focused their fire on the hull and deck. If we go out the breach and swim under the surface, we might make it to the rock before they see us. And then we live long enough to die of thirst instead of drowning. It's a marginal improvement." Pugh grabbed Velasco's arm, pulling him toward where water now poured through the shattered hull. "But I didn't serve under you for 6 years to watch you die because Vicente Cabral was a greedy fool. Move, Captain." They went through the breach into open ocean, the shock of submersion stealing Velasco's breath. Around him, the sea churned with debris and bodies. Men who'd served under him died because of him, betrayed him and paid the price. He surfaced once, gasped air, glimpsed 4 Portuguese warships arranged in a semicircle around the dying Sangre del Mar, their decks alive with sailors reloading cannon and muskets. Then Pugh pulled him under again and they swam, lungs burning, until Velasco's hand struck stone. They hauled themselves onto the rock just as the Sangre del Mar went under, her red sails trailing like bloodstains as she sank. Portuguese sailors cheered from their decks. A few musket shots cracked, aimed at survivors trying to cling to floating wreckage, and then silence as the last of Velasco's crew slipped beneath the waves. The Red Captain sat on bare stone, coughing seawater and watching his ship disappear, and understood with perfect clarity that Vicente Cabral had been right about one thing. Rodrigo Velasco had survived every battle. The Spanish at Havana, the English in the Atlantic, the Dutch off Curaçao, the French in the Windward Passage. All of them had tried to kill him, and all had failed. But no captain, no matter how skilled or feared or lucky, could survive the enemy within. Mutiny was the death that waited for every pirate who commanded long enough, and the only variable was whether it came quickly or slowly, with mercy or with malice. The Portuguese ships were lowering boats now, sending armed parties to sweep the rock and ensure no survivors escaped. Velasco watched them come and made no move to hide or flee. There was nowhere to go, no final trick to play, no desperate gambit that might buy one more day of life. His career of piracy, his legend as the Red Captain, the myth of the man who could not be killed, all of it ended here on this nameless rock, brought down not by superior force, but by the greed and fear of men who should have trusted him. Gareth Pugh sat beside him, breathing hard, blood still flowing from his head wound. "I'm sorry, Captain," he said quietly. "I knew something was wrong, tried to warn you in Nassau, but you wouldn't listen. Thought you had it under control." "I thought so too," Velasco replied. "I was wrong." The Portuguese boats reached the rock. Soldiers poured out, muskets raised, surrounding the two survivors. An officer approached, resplendent in his uniform despite the spray and blood, and spoke in Portuguese that Velasco understood perfectly, having been born in Spanish colonial lands where Portuguese traders were common. "Rodrigo Velasco, the Red Captain." "I was," Velasco answered in the same language. "Now, I'm just a man who made poor choices about whom to trust." The officer smiled without warmth. "You'll hang in Cartagena. The governor there has offered a reward for your capture. Your legend ends on a gallows, pirate, where all your kind eventually end." They bound him again. His wrists were becoming accustomed to the feeling, and dragged him to the boats. As they rowed back toward the Portuguese flagship, Velasco looked back at the place where the Sangre del Mar had gone down. Already the sea was smoothing over, erasing any evidence that a ship had died there. In a week, there would be nothing to mark the spot. In a month, even the currents would have dispersed the wreckage beyond finding. His red sails, which had terrorized the Caribbean for 6 years, would become nothing more than a story told in port taverns, embellished with each telling, until the truth became impossible to separate from legend. The Red Captain had survived every battle except the one inside his crew. That would be his epitaph, his warning to any pirate who thought loyalty could be purchased with plunder or maintained through fear. He'd killed over 100 men in combat and lost count of how many ships he'd taken. But in the end, it wasn't skill or courage or luck that had doomed him. It was the simple, terrible fact that men who live by violence can only trust each other until they glimpse something they want more than brotherhood. They threw him in the hold of the Portuguese flagship, where he sat in darkness that smelled of gunpowder and old blood, and waited for the journey to Cartagena and the gallows that waited there. He did not pray. The Virgin his mother had worshipped would not intercede for a man with his history. But he did think about the map, about Vicente Cabral's face when he'd realized the truth, about how a single piece of blood-stained parchment had destroyed everything. 3 weeks later, in the plaza of Cartagena, they put a rope around Rodrigo Velasco's neck and hanged him, while a crowd of merchants and sailors and colonial officials watched and cheered. His body swung in the Caribbean breeze for 3 days before they cut it down and threw it in an unmarked grave outside the city walls. No monument marked his passing, no ship flew red sails in his memory. Pirates who heard the story learned the lesson and forgot the name, which was exactly as it should be. But the map survived. The Portuguese recovered it from Cabral's body after the sinking of the Sangre del Mar, and some junior officer, not understanding its significance, filed it away in the naval archives in Lisbon. 300 years later, a historian would find it, would note the bloodstains and the coordinates, and would write a footnote in an academic paper about Portuguese anti-piracy operations in the early 18th century. The footnote would mention an unnamed pirate captain who'd followed a false treasure map to his doom, betrayed by his own crew, killed by their greed and his inability to control the poison it spread. The scholar would never learn that the pirate had been called the Red Captain, or that his name was Rodrigo Velasco, or that he'd survived 23 battles only to die because he'd trusted men who valued gold over loyalty. All of that had been erased by time and water, by the Caribbean's indifference to human ambition and failure. Only the blood-stained map remained, locked in an archive in a city that the Red Captain had never seen, a monument to the truth that every pirate eventually learned. The sea forgives nothing, betrayal is the only certain currency, and the most dangerous battle is always the one you fight against the men who call you captain.